On? Okay. So welcome back to this second session of today's roundtable on whether the EU can achieve technological sovereignty. I want to thank once more, first of all, the Center for the Study of Europe, which has made this possible, as well as the European Commission's Jean Monnet chair, which is also helping to finance this event. So for the second session, we're going to focus, instead of focusing so much on regulation intended to protect European values, we're going to focus on the question of the kinds of infrastructure that the EU may be missing to try to compete in this period of AI. And this is something that the EU has been taking quite seriously for the last few years. Our guests are Erik Peinert from the Political Science Department at Boston University and author of his recent book, Monopoly Politics, in which he deals with some of the questions that we're talking about here today, and Joseph Jerome, who is coming to us from DuckDuckGo and is our industry speaker or interlocutor. So having said that, I would like to start with Erik. And my general question is, what kind of challenges does the EU face? One of the motives kind of leading recent initiatives has been the idea that the EU needs to catch up with the two economies in the world, the US and China, which have become most advanced in the development of artificial intelligence. There are a lot of things that the United States has that the EU perceives as not having, and so what are some of those?
Great. So that's a good question. I mean, I'll reiterate what Giacomo said in the first session, is that like with a lot of the aspects of the overall technological infrastructure or the tech stack needed for AI in particular, it doesn't exist in Europe at all for the most part. There are a couple of companies at various elements of it, but it's largely something that's not there. I want to also open by just saying thank you for having me. My background, as Sofia said, is mostly in issues around antitrust and competition and market power and dealing with those commercial dynamics. So a lot of my comments are going to come from that perspective. That being said, I'm probably going to start and be like the ultimate American in the room and sort of cut through and put to the side a lot of the important details of European regulation and sort of European member state relations and whatnot, not because they're not important, but because I want to frame sort of what the overall problem is, or as I see it, admittedly looking from this side of the Atlantic, for the geopolitical position that the European Union and Europe finds itself in relative to the rest of the world. So there's several categories of things that I think are just a fundamental problem here that have really come into view centrally because of the Trump administration, especially the second time around, but not just. So there is first of all, a security vulnerability. The European Union, European states, local governments, militaries are incredibly dependent on technology that has to be imported from the US or China, though China, for the most part, Europe has tried to avoid. And for a long time, since World War II, Europe has been able to rely on US military technologies, US IT technologies for security systems and for everything as mundane as the local mayor's office, Microsoft Office suite. And that's great. Like, we can all hate Microsoft Office suite. It's a terrible piece of software. It costs a ton of money. You don't see those prices because no one pays for it, but anyone you ever work for will pay an exorbitant sum to have access to those software. But in a world where that's increasingly becoming clear in the last 10 years or so, where geopolitical powers are willing to use all of those interdependencies as a point of leverage for coercion over each other. Do what I want or I will shut your systems off. do what I want, or I will cut off your access to something. And this happens especially in things like finance. So swift sanctions have been among the main things that have cut off various geopolitical opponents of the US. But technology also is another opening for this. Any technological infrastructure that anyone else in the world relies on that is closely tied to the US state, as most of Silicon Valley is, the US arguably down the road, if they do not already, is going to have the ability to turn it off. And in a world where the Trump administration is the head of the United States and MAGA-like leaders are, the European Union has recognized that they face a security vulnerability. Even if that isn't from the Trump administration or from the United States itself, they can't necessarily rely on the US to protect them from other threats like Russia right on their doorstep. That's only one of the three problems I'm going to emphasize here. The second one is growth. We are, as I think Joe mentioned on the first panel, there is an argument that we're at a technological and economic inflection point. New technologies break through to points where there's a new way of economic growth and investment and jobs creation and whatnot. And you can think back to textiles with the first industrial revolution, things like steel and chemicals, and then cars in the mid-20th century, and maybe the internet 2.0. And now that's AI. And whether or not people are right, most people around the world, whether it's China, EU, the US, anywhere else, there's sort of a belief that AI systems are going to be at the core, at some level, of the next wave of economic growth. And the EU has no domestic, internal ability to generate the types of AI systems that are expected to be able to do that. And there's a background here with the EU. This comes after 10 years of austerity politics, of very low investment, comparatively low growth compared to the rest of the world following the 2008 crisis, when Europe fought amongst member states over who was going to be responsible for the sovereign debt and the fallout from the euro crisis in the 2010s. That's number two, economic growth and the expectation that AI is going to be at some level a driver or a key component of it. And the third one, which isn't exactly the first, is military. AI is a dual-use military technology. It is already being used extensively by departments of war, departments of defense, whatever you want to call these ministries, getting renamed around here all the time. But the battlefields that are expected, depending on how much conflict we expect there to be, are going to be heavily driven and integrated with AI and machine learning systems. Ukraine already looks like a very automated war with swarms of AI-guided drones protecting tanks, destroying tanks. It's already very futuristic. That's already with us. And so that's the overall importance. The threat that the US can cut off Europe if it gets mad, the threat that the US might not protect Europe in a variety of ways, and this goes from everything from the local government's office suite to the IT systems that a European military might rely on. Okay, so that's a problem, and now there's what are the things that are actually needed to be able to get some of these AI systems? And this is where the problem becomes more clear. And Joe and Giacomo actually already premised to some of these things, but it helps to go back about 20 years to when these very profitable companies like Google and Meta came into being. They are what is known as the platform business model. It is very cheap. It is extraordinarily profitable. Basically, an digital market technology company puts themselves in the middle of some system where they connect buyers and sellers. Google connects you to the stuff you're looking up the internet. It connects advertisers, where they really made their money to begin with the types of people who want to put stuff to sell in front of you. But it costs them almost nothing to do this. And there's first mover advantages here. If you're the first one to make a Google, you are going to be the Google. And it's very hard, no offense to DuckDuckGo, to displace or create some sort of market where there's 6 of them that are largely at the same level. Now, that's hard to do, to break into that. But that's where the American tech industry comes from. That sort of model, Uber, Lyft, Google, Meta, Amazon, all are various versions of this. Even before AI, the transition that started to happen was much more that the value started to move into the cloud. Having As the amount of data that these companies had to process went up, as the amount of data they had, as the amount of computational power that new technologies allowed them to use, the value became in more and more complex algorithms. Gigantic data centers that cost billions of dollars to build, that are very expensive, but they could be funded out of the enormous profits from the platforms. Amazon Web Services, for example, very profitable, funded, built out of capital expenditures because these companies already had money printing machines, as Joe had said. Okay, and then AI comes along. And what we know as the AI tech stack, the thing you need to be able to build one of these foundational large language models or diffusion models or sort of the core machine learning models that are needed or expected to maybe be needed for future economic growth, for military dependence or whatnot, most people break it into 4 stages. There is one, which is the hardware, the chips. Building fancy chips that you can get 100 billion transistors into something about this big, and all of the companies that do that are either American or East Asian. NVIDIA is the one everybody knows of that designs the most advanced AI chips, but they are put together physically in East Asia. The next layer is cloud. This is all the big data centers. They buy all the chips, they put them in a rack in the data center, very expensive. All the big hyperscaling companies that build those data centers or run those clouds are American or Chinese. So Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, etc., all American, and then Chinese tech companies are building these out at massive scale, in part because the Chinese state recognizes their geopolitical desire to be in this area. Then there are the actual models, ChatGPT, Claude, all of the chatbots that you go and talk to on a daily or monthly basis or however much you use it. These are extraordinarily expensive to build, but they'd rely on the previous 2 layers. These models are all 100% American or Chinese. DeepSeek's the most well-known Chinese one. Whether or not they are doing it fully of their own capacity and rather than sort of using American models' advantages to be able to build their own models, it doesn't matter at some level. They have their own base models. And then there's the last one, which I'm sort of going to put to the side in terms of its overall importance for this, is the applications. When you pull up ChatGPT, you are talking to ChatGPT, not the foundational model, which is called GPT. And this can be everything from stuff specialized for medical records or stuff specialized for defense purposes, for law or whatnot. But these are sort of the things that you're expected to be able to make money on or put applications into. Now, to put the vulnerability at scale, to explain, again, Europe doesn't have hyperscalers. It doesn't have the clouds. It doesn't have the ability to build the chips, so it needs to buy them from a Chinese fab or a Taiwanese fab, a chip that's designed by an American company to a hyperscaler building a data center that is probably an American company with a couple very small European exceptions, to then be able to train one of these models. These models cost about $200 billion to train. Each one, the cost keeps going up. You cannot rely on a geopolitical adversary's model. There are too many ways, and computer scientists have not figured out ways to deal with them, of hiding backdoors, security vulnerabilities, and whatnot in the model in a way that it is absolutely impossible to find. So there is, just from geopolitical or business perspective, a fundamental necessity or desire to be able to have your own, that you know what's in it, or at least a control of what goes into it and how it works. That's bleak. I'm not gonna lie. And it's really bleak. If you use DeepSeek, China can hide whatever into it into the model. Even if the American model doesn't have backdoors, if someone snuck one into it, you are relying on a system that has flaws in it that someone who might be your geopolitical opponent can use. And they can use these for things like having it crash when they need it to at a particular point of financial necessity, of literal battlefield necessity, of whatever. And so what to do about this? Sort of the real question here, and there's a couple proposals that I would say I've heard of, and a couple ways that I would frame to think about this. The one that has come up and has dominated discussions in the European Union for the last couple of years is mostly the proposals out of the Draghi report from 2024. Europe has a competitiveness problem. Draghi report doesn't just talk about AI, but it's central. And the understanding is that European trade, industrial, and competition policies both have a little bit too much regulation, but they're mostly misaligned to build future technologies, breakthrough innovations of the type that the United States has. And again, speaking as an American, and I'd love for people to disagree with me about this, there's a sort of through line here that a lot of what the proposals are to make the European Union's regulatory framework more like the United States's. The US clearly has this AI system. They're able to compete and survive against China at some level. And so adopt more American versions of things like competition policies to allow European mergers to get up to the scale and profitability needed by these American tech giants, etc. That's ignoring the problems the US has. The US growth right now is like very tracked onto just AI and ignoring the fact that China is actually moving ahead of the US in most other sectors, just the same as it is moving ahead of the European Union. Whether it's EVs, solar, wind, like almost everything outside of AI, China's moving ahead, certainly on the manufacturing front. And so I don't know that the Draghi report is providing a solution if you're like, let's become more like the potentially also sinking ship that is the US right now. I'm not meaning to be entirely bleak here. And I think that the thing I'll close on before we like sort of make this more of a conversation is I think, and especially when it comes to the European Union, Europe has long operated on sort of an ideological framework that I fundamentally hold. I agree with. Individual rights, protections, privacy protections, especially sort of like guaranteed rule of law, etc. And for a long time, when Europe and the United States were the technological leaders of the world, the technologically most advanced, militarily most powerful units in world politics, there was a certain amount where you could rely on the choices that you made in Europe or in the United States to sort of set the tone of what military and economic competition was going to be globally. This has been called the Brussels effect in the European Union, when the European Union sort of adopts a general blanket regulatory framework for an industry, it very frequently spreads to the rest of the world, and with a certain logic. The EU is a huge market of around 500 million people. But if you're dealing with a world now where the key technologies are held by other players, and one of whom is certainly a geopolitical adversary, that necessarily can't be relied on. And so what I'm sort of like suggesting, and I don't like thinking this way, but it's something that comes to my mind a lot lately, is that framework of individual rights and protections and sort of assuming that when you make a choice to protect people from AI systems or to, ensure competition or whatnot, and not that I disagree with any of these things, but they're very misaligned with the geopolitical world that Europe, the US, and China are in today. So when I'd say like what needs to be done, if I was like thinking about Europe's position, there's an unfortunate reality that countries, when they find themselves technologically and economically behind, they have to accept that dependence for a certain period of time. And Europe is recognizing this at some level and adopting many of the tools that China used to catch up when it was once itself behind, demanding technology sharing for the China to have access to the European market in various forms. These sort of things that late economic developers do to accept that they are relying on foreign technology, foreign know-how, but it's an uncomfortable position for the European Union to be in. It's an uncomfortable position for the US to be in, but the US isn't there at the point where they feel like they have to be. I've rambled enough as it is, so I'll turn it to other questions or comments, but those are a lot of my thoughts right now, and I don't mean this to be bleak, but it is a really hard situation.
Did you want to respond to any of that?
No, I tend to frame myself as Mr. Doom and Gloom, so I think we're aligned that there's some bleakness here. The only provocation I really have is that I think you're correct that it's a big problem. You're not going to solve it overnight. There's nothing you can do, whether it's a whole of the economy effort, a huge monetary space. You're not going to solve this overnight. I guess to be a little bit more optimistic, and I haven't thought about this at length, are there ways to sort of chip at this, or at least start building a couple of things? An example I want to give, so in my universe, search engines. One thing that isn't part of the core AI stack, but nevertheless I think is really important for a lot of consumer applications of AI, is basically access to a web index. These models, as everybody knows, like they're trained on data at a certain point in time. They're not exactly great at understanding current real-time information unless they have access to other sources of information. This is another area where Google has a tremendous advantage because they have the best web index on the planet. But they don't have the only web index on the planet. So, one of the efforts that I've been monitoring in the EU has been a joint venture between Quant and Ecosia, which are two EU-based search engines. One's in France and one's in Germany. And they are, with I believe the support of the European government, they've entered into a joint venture to try and build a European search index. Search index are also, they don't cost $200 billion to build, but they're not cheap. But I look at this effort by European companies to try to build some of the infrastructure in search that would make them less dependent on American companies as a good first step. I look at also, like, there are a couple of organizations in the US that have been very bullish about the need for public AI, which I think would be great in the United States, but also seems like something that the EU could explore.
Hours.
Sorry about that.
And I'm curious what both of you think about that. Because, look, obviously, if you build a public AI, which is, again, this is not government-supported AI. This is literally a government providing the resources to build an AI stack that's available to all. You're still gonna be at a disadvantage to the hyperscalers in terms of maybe the quality of all of this. But strikes me as a way for the EU to maybe pool together resources and get some of the way there, recognizing that they'll still be behind.
Yeah, so that's sort of the next step of what I was thinking is like, yes, there's a doom and gloom here, and some of this is to convey, depending on what your background is here. I know there's some Europeans in the audience, but like from the American perspective, when the U.S. is lacking some major technological capability, there's a response, as you said, just like throw money at it.
Yes.
So the U.S. has most of this stack, but realized suddenly in 2021, when the world was facing chip shortages from the fallout from COVID, the U.S. can throw billions of dollars and suddenly, hopefully, not have chip shortages anymore because the government threw $40 billion at building a bunch of fabs in the United States that can resolve that. But the U.S. had all the other parts of most technological and industrial sort of capacities that are necessary for these domains already. So it can sort of plug in one with a bunch of money. But it's a harder thing to do if it's the whole supply chain, as it is with AI in Europe, and you need to start somewhere. And so I guess what I'm saying, adopt the tools of other late developers, late industrializers, and I'm just speaking to what China has done, and it's unfortunately thinking about the scale of the task. It's a generational task at some level. Back in the 1980s and 90s, China would just recognize, okay, we don't know how to do that. We're going to do this for the foreign company and learn how to do this part of the industry or this commercial capability and slowly learn from them to be able to generate our own. And what we are seeing now is the generational outcome of those levels of the Chinese state accepting that dependence on foreign powers to build their own capabilities that they now have. And although Europe is certainly not as far behind and as impoverished as China was in the 1980s, in this particular industry domain of tech products and tech commercial abilities, it is facing a similar generational task. You have to start somewhere with something that you can be good at. And I think something like a pan-European search engine is probably a good place to start. But I'm also not sufficiently an expert to know exactly where you should start, whether
fair
developing some applications, but the core security vulnerability of relying on someone else's foundation models where you don't know what's in them because even the people that build them don't really know what's in them perfectly. that's sort of the like end point, at least when it comes to dependence with AI to get to, and it's years away as far as to my understanding.
Okay, so so my thinking also in response to some of the things that you've said and you've said earlier, Joe, is that first of all there isn't the native technology, right? So there is in Europe some of the native technology isn't there, and there's this dependence on these large American companies, and some of the concern about that, right? Has to do, there are two different kinds of concerns. One is we're not keeping up, and these other two countries are just going to be able to produce all these things, EVs that involve a lot of AI, they're going to outcompete us, so there's the competitiveness concern, right? But then there's the other concern, which is the idea that using this foreign technology can be weaponized in some way. And I think that that concern was probably there already when it came to Chinese technology, but it has become much more important as of very recently, as we've seen the Trump administration kind of weaponize trade policy, for instance, in a way that Europeans couldn't even envision. So I think that there's this kind of new concern that isn't so much about competitiveness anymore and has to do just with sheer technological dependence on private companies, but that these private companies somehow, because they're under the jurisdiction of a foreign country, the government of which could decide to weaponize them in some way, could be a real danger. Now, I think kind of going back to the why don't we have these companies in the first place, which is more the competitiveness concern, there's one vision in the Draghi report, which is just that there are things about the American economy that make the American economy more conducive to innovation, right? And one of those things, of course, one of them is there's less regulation, there's that kind of idea. But then another one is the US has these very flexible, very deep sources of capital for new companies and in terms of venture capital and in terms of the depth of the American equity markets. And so I think that there's one view which is, well, what we need to do is we need to emulate what the Americans have, which frankly, that's something that's been around in EU policy for a long time. It's the too much regulation. We need to lower the levels of regulation on all kinds of things. But what I'm hearing from you is that the emergence of these big tech companies, especially when you were comparing kind of Google and Meta to ChatGPT before, is first of all, one of them is timing. So they the first entry advantage, or the first, use another term.
So it's
a first mover advantage.
It's first mover from network effects, because like Facebook was valuable because all your friends are on it. It is worthless to build Facebook and you and one of your friends to be on there. So once everyone's on Facebook, Facebook's the place to be. And
So
someone
this is like
offering
the
a competing,
blue sky story, basically.
yeah,
They're
someone
trying to
offering a
emulate it.
competing network that your friends aren't on. No one wants to go on that.
Right.
Yeah.
I just want
Please.
to. I mean, this. I don't want us
Yes.
to get too
No,
distracted
go
here, but
ahead.
it's interesting because the EU tries to address things like that through data portability tools, which again go back to what I was saying earlier. Great idea, but then the data portability requirements in the GDPR and it's the Data Act. You look at those and like, oh, you could do some really interesting stuff, and there are efforts in the EU. I'm going to draw a blank at the group that organizes the My Data conference, full of all these interesting ideas. but then they deal with this fundamental challenge of the big tech companies create portability in the most limited way, and so the actual portability that would allow you to maybe get the escape velocity to overcome these network effects just doesn't appear. And I think that there's a lot of examples where EU regulation, like it's figured out the problem, but it hasn't delivered the result that would actually let business model quickly jump in and actually make money off of that. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no. Well, then, so going back to this question of, where does the money come from, right? Now, so you're not the first mover. That's, a deadly situation, because you're not going to have the flow of revenue that the first movers have. It seems like that has a lot to do with kind of the consumer market, right? The reason why Google and Facebook have these revenue flows is because they have all these consumers, and that's really hard to compete with.
Well, when you say consumer, I mean also like I would view enterprise as similar to that. Just
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you have more of a sense of how big the revenues are coming maybe than I.
No, I just think at the same. I think the same.
I
think the same dynamics exist with cloud computing, and that's not necessarily like.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
So I do think, and Giacomo, maybe you can supplement me here, that the EU has actually been doing things to try to address those. Very recently there've been sort of changes to competition policy. You mentioned that earlier, to allow bigger mergers. This is sort of the traditional strength of the EU is competition policy. And so there are ways in which they are thinking of changing the merger rules so as to allow maybe bigger companies to emerge. There's investment in these computing facilities that are meant to allow people to have access big computing power in various places in Europe. These are basically EU-funded facilities. So I do see that there is some sort of move towards industrial policy of some sort, which of course is that type of policy that kind of runs against competitive markets, because you're going to have, to some extent, you're going to have some government official kind of benefiting some companies and not others. So I do think that the lesson taken from the recent experience, and then especially with the added kind of sense that this is now a real emergency, especially with needing to become more independent militarily, that there is a kind of shift towards an EU-wide industrial policy that can kind of make up for some of these things. So that was my thinking. I'm not sure, for instance, there is also a very big push to accelerate the capital, now called Savings and Investment Union. There's a lot, my understanding is that national capital market authorities are very against that because they all have different rules, and so that would be a big thing to overcome. But there is some sort of sense that the traditional rules, the traditional focus on assuring competitive markets alone isn't going to do it.
Yeah. No. Yeah, but I think this is only the top of the barrel, right? Because of course we have new guidelines on vertical integration, for instance, as far as charters or so-called Article 101 breaches are concerned. The provision indeed against agreements or concerted practices between undertakings is concerned. So of course we have some facilitation. We have new guidelines on state aids in areas that can affect indeed technological research and development and so on and so forth. But these are, I think, only a part of the tools that should be used to solve the problem. Because the problem we have, at least as we see it from Brussels, is that we do not have the capacity, and the question is how to create that. So perhaps also the question I had in mind for you, I mean, is this only an issue of research and innovation that Europe, as Draghi said, doesn't innovate enough, or is it an issue also of scaling, that we don't manage to go from 0 to 1? And there's another point on the military. Don't forget that we have in the AI Act, I think this is mentioned, it is in Article 3 of the regulation, that the regulation doesn't apply to items that have only an exclusive military purpose. However, 4 months after the AI Act, the Court of Justice delivered a judgment called Neves 77, in which they said plainly that trade in weapons and even exclusively military items falls squarely within the scope of the common commercial policy externally and internally within the internal market competence. And this has changed a lot, to the point that last year the Commission has issued a guideline that, of course, it's called the AI, I think, Content Index, something of the sort, in which they now explicitly refer to military. So I'm quite curious that the AI Act might evolve, this is, of course, again, my personal view, but might evolve also following this unexpected legal developments, also to cover finally I think the missing part because of the puzzle. Because if we talk about geoeconomics and international strategies, everybody knows that behind the dollar you have 17 aircraft carriers, and behind the yuan you have the Chinese military army, and behind the euro, so far we have just 27 not very well organized national military armies with some kind of coordination, with some kind of channel procurement. So I think that might change a little bit. I think if in Brussels, let's say, our decision, our political masters see the potential of covering also the military bits with the AI regulation. But again, what is really missing indeed, also the fact that I finished that I would say more than 75% of the business in Europe is SMEs, small and medium enterprises. We do not have, we didn't scale also in other areas of the internal market. And this is an issue. Of course, it can be a resource for public procurement because you can make them grow, but it doesn't necessarily work. In a couple of years, you need more time, and I think we don't have much time in this in the current framework.
Right.
I guess I can add to that, sort of on your thought of like, is this a matter of sort of like the Draghi report? There's multiple threads in the Draghi report, but one of them is the lack of European innovation. And your question, is this a matter of lack of innovation, of developing new things that no one has heard of, or is it like scaling of the things we do know how to build, data centers or whatever, chips, if we're talking just about AI? And like, I think this is one of those moments where I'd say I don't know how separable those are. And I'm going to sort of say that, as an example, like history doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. Because a lot of these conversations harken back to like the moment that Europe found itself in the 1960s. And there were like a bunch of books going around Europe at the time, like The Industrial Imperative or The American Challenge. These were both French authors because the French loved industrial policy. That, the Europe had just removed all their internal tariff barriers, the tariffs around the world were dropping, and European industry was recognizing we need to face up to American firms that know how to build cars, chemicals, steel, everything. And one of the responses across Europe was, at one level, yes, adopt industrial policies to be able to catch up. The French especially were like noted for this, but there was pan-European industrial policies. Airbus was generated out of this. But like, I guess what I'm saying here is that like there was a set of technologies that everybody recognized that you needed to do to catch up there. You needed to figure out how the American car makers slapped together a car so cheaply and did it so well and copy that, and then learn to do it better. And German car makers learned how to do this, French car makers learned how to do this, Japanese car makers learned how to do this. And like that spread to a whole lot of other industries of putting together physical stuff that you could buy, sell, and drop on your foot. Well, you can't drop a car, but you know what I mean. And now there's a recognition that like a lot of countries are looking at the US and China and be like, we sort of might know what the next thing is, and we're seeing the parts of that, and we need to both copy, learn how to build the data centers, learn how to build the chips, or like find some way to be integrated into those things and then do them better. And so like I don't know, like learning how to scale is itself an innovation that American tech companies learned how to do in the 2010s. Chinese companies have learned how to do in every field imaginable over the last 20 years. And learning how to do that is both a matter of the policy space provided by incentives, protections, as well as just like skills development, having companies just actually go out and do it. Just pay for the data centers and you'll some level learn how to do them. It's not a simple task. A lot of countries have tried to do this in a lot of other domains and failed. But like it is, I think I'm just trying to make the comparison that like Europe's been here before, like with the analogy of the 1960s and catching up with the United States. It's just right now it's not so obvious that the American model is the one that like they want to import all of the measures from, especially because yes, US is doing great in AI and related fields, but it is struggling in a lot of others that we haven't talked about as much today.
Of course, there's also the sort of big bazooka, which is the idea of, you know, if other countries are going to be imposing tariffs on our automobiles, maybe we should be imposing tariffs on American, computer licenses, and that would be a place to get a lot of money from and to somehow try to invert it, right? Not that would last, not that that's a permanent solution of some sort, but it is something that the EU has held off this entire time.
So just to like extend the analogy,
Yeah.
you're pointing like previous era, physical stuff, you can tariff a car. Okay, now we're talking data, internet access, apps, AI systems, etc. You can like block those. What if we did a similar thing? Some of that's already happening, especially sitting in the United States. We're used to thinking about an open internet where you can just like get whatever you want, whenever you want, and there's no blockages. The internet is already fragmenting based on many of these geopolitical divisions. The Chinese internet is just wildly different from the one that we have here. And it's not just that it's in a different language and you can't have it. It's literally a different internet. And we're used to thinking that of like, oh, that's China over there, they're a different thing. But even between the US and EU and some other major geopolitical players, the internet's starting to look different. Businesses especially are aware of this because it makes it much more costly for them to like have the platform in multiple jurisdictions as the EU regulations start looking very different from the US ones, and hoovering up everybody's data is a lot easier to do in the US than it is in the EU, and that like informs a lot of business decisions. But like at some level the internet's already breaking apart into these segments. I don't know if that's been thought of as like a specific strategic possibility to like help with having a European digital market that's separate from those to be able to build these capacities. But I think it's one angle that would be possible. As
a one-time open internet crusader, I definitely agree that the internet is splintering a bit. I think it becomes a question of prioritization. I mean, one thing we haven't spoken about, and that I will disclaim expertise on, is the role of intellectual property and its intersection with AI. That strikes me as an area where I don't have expertise on the EU, but where I think there could be challenges. Speaking as a search engine company, I mean, we have issues right now in the EU with respect to the EU's copyright directive, which has lack of clarity about what's known as web snippets. So when you go to a search engine, you don't just get a link; you get some sort of description of what the website is. EU law envisions this, but also gives extract is a negative term, come up with basically what compensation do they deserve for their content. And we've been in a position to be like, look, we make negative, like, one other thing about search engines, just so people are aware, like, you don't make the same amount of money everywhere. In fact, there are places around the world where serving search results actually produces negative amounts of money. And so when you start talking about the like with publishers and I don't mean to suggest that their content has no value in terms of money and value, but if they're asking for compensation and this is in a market where we don't make money, it's hard for us to justify offering a service. And so it's not for nothing that we've had considerations of just DuckDuckGo won't be available in certain jurisdictions. And so, that is one area where I think the EU generally has been much more friendly to publishers, whether that's just to facilitate creative enterprises. But that is in tension with data. That's another example, like with privacy, where you have data-hungry industries, or frankly, even if you start coming up with licensing regimes where, coming back to what I said earlier, the big players have the deep pockets to just pay for the licenses, which again further locks you into their ecosystem. I don't have an answer there because again I think publishers have gotten a raw deal on things. It's not great that Google has thrown everything into AI instant answers and shut off traffic across the web. And it's not necessarily great that all sorts of AI companies have been destroying books at scale to create these models. But those are the practices that these companies have engaged in to produce the AI technologies that we're discussing here. So another area where it's bleak.
Okay, well, let me actually see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes?
One question. My name is Marian Rezinski. I'm professor in computer science at BU. I really appreciate that you mentioned automotive and physical goods because the chip industry is much more pervasive than just having high-end chips for machine learning and artificial intelligence applications. And I wanted to ask you for your perspective on the U.S. reliance on Taiwan's semiconductor industry because there are two interrelated aspects of it. The first one is that the U.S. is currently competing in producing high-end chips, state-of-the-art chips for artificial intelligence, and secondly has long lost the ability to have the foundry model, meaning both designing and producing the chips on American soil, mostly except for maybe 2-3 companies. One of them is Intel, but we know that it's on a very high, like substantial government subsidy, basically. So what this means is that the American consumers are highly reliant for daily goods that they're using on a daily basis for foreign technology. So at one point, it's not excluded to have a situation where people would not be considered having the latest LLM on their phone, but they would be considered whether they would have access to a car, so they can go to the grocery store 15 miles away to buy something. So what is your perspective on this reliance of US? Because currently on this discussion, the US was portrayed as the ultimate decision maker in terms of technology, but the world is a little bit more complex than that.
So it's one of the reasons why I went back to this, because the chips is the one thing where the U.S., of the technologies we talked about today, the U.S. is just utterly dependent. After the CHIPS Act, there's been 1 or 2 fabs built in Arizona that are able to build the highest end chips needed for AI. Your phones also have the similarly tiny process node, most advanced chips, but still most of them are built in Taiwan, in 2-3 buildings in Taiwan. There's a couple things about this that I'd say, and not to overly complicate this, that is the most advanced chips are where the most dependence is. And that's really limited to data center chips. And so all of the AI GPUs are built by TSMC. And your phones are the main things. And then there's some military technologies, but most of those are actually less advanced and built by trusted US suppliers. But you still have a point where it's US has a dependence on Taiwan, and there is a whole geopolitical mess where Taiwan is, they won't say so very loudly, but very explicitly has a silicon shield where they are relying on the US to come defend them if they get invaded because they are the sole supplier of the most advanced chips. I don't have a great solution to that. Will the US defend them? A invasion across the Taiwan Strait, I am not a military expert, but I am told that would be a bloodbath for mainland China. Like, they probably don't want to do it. But it nonetheless is a still dependence, and it's one of the motivations. So I agree, but it's not going to stop US consumers from having cars.
No, but this is the point. It's not the state-of-the-art chips. It's everyday chips with technologies from 10 years ago that can no longer be produced here because it's prohibitively expensive to be done in the United States.
So
Who's going to pay the workers to work in those factories in the United States? Like, the economics really doesn't fit on a paper.
Okay, so great. So I answered the highest end chips question, and then there's what's called mature node, or I forget, this bunch of nodes of terms for these types of more older chips. They sell for $1.50 cents each. This is what all the COVID shortages were driven by. A couple things I would say is the semiconductor industry is weird in a couple ways. Every state that still has a viable semiconductor industry has heavily subsidized it. They are loss leaders. They lose a lot of money. Taiwan has heavily subsidized its chip industry to the degree that it's survived. Japan heavily subsidized its chip industry. Korea heavily subsidized its chip industry. And now around the world, with those COVID-era shortages, everybody's throwing a ton of money in it. They lose money in a cyclical way. So, and it's not primarily the workers that are the expense. It's the cost of the building relative to the fact that the chips are worth almost nothing individually. It's just a weird industry to regulate. And there's a common problem in the US, especially when the US was trying to do industrial policy for chips, of getting American businesses to buy them. And they all sort of had this weird thing where we don't want shortages again, but we don't want to pay 5 cents rather than 2. I reckon it's a dependence, but there's no clear resolution to it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I rambled too long.
Okay, any other questions? Yes.
If I could have just a moment, Jean Le Carré moment, the spy novelist, of course. So I really just want to pick up a little bit on your comment about a backdoor in DeepSeek, and I'm sort of thinking to myself, somebody, if there is a backdoor, knows there's a backdoor. It's probably a Chinese developer. That Chinese developer is sort of a very valuable commodity to China and Chinese intelligence, who would presumably exploit this. And they could either want that individual to think, if you reveal that secret, you could be dead. American intelligence might think, boy, we'd pay you a lot of money if you would tell us that secret, and then we'll spirit you away and make you safe. Where I'm really going to go with my question a little bit, though, is this idea of policy, national security, this nexus, and any thoughts you'd like to sort of speculate on where this meets, that if you know your American intelligence and you know there's a backdoor, somehow you've paid this person off, and you know that Chinese intelligence is using that backdoor for economic advantage, then presumably that comes at the economic disadvantage of wherever that intelligence is coming, presumably maybe Americans, maybe Europeans. How long do you let that go on before you decide, if you ever decide, to reveal, like in a 0 day, if you think of 0 days, to reveal that you've known that Chinese intelligence has been sucking up this information at the expense of your American companies, your European companies, your Latin American countries, all the rest of it?
I am not a technology expert and certainly not an espionage expert, and someone who knows computer science would be able to explain, but I'd say the potential vulnerabilities are broader to my understanding than like an individual flaw, and it's not just a state actor who could put them in there, and it's not even the person who built the model who would have to put them in there. The one that I have a loose understanding of is like, it doesn't take that many documents with like a specific code on them that then tells the LLM to be super compliant with whatever you want, throw them into the training data, just sneak them into someone else's training data, and then when you show that chain of random gibberish letters to the LLM once it's been fully trained, it will be deeply compliant to whatever you want. The people who made the model might not even know it's there. And it's not just that there'd be one that you know about. It might be that a bunch of people snuck those things in. It might be that they snuck 12 in. And so like, it doesn't go away if it's your own model, but it certainly would make you skeptical if you go onto DeepSeek that Chinese intelligence puts 600 of those in there, and the models have, I don't know how many billion parameters. There's just no way to go and find it unless you know it's there. So I'd say like, yeah, if you know about one, what do you do? But the problem's just so much broader that
I want to be very careful what I say because this is a pretty politically loaded question. But I'll just echo that I think that there are some fundamental security vulnerabilities with this entire stack.
Yeah.
Like, Erik's focusing on foundation models, but whether it's the capabilities of Mythos having to be shared with a bunch of other companies just to sort of let's like red team this to see how bad it is. I know it's an issue that we at DuckDuckGo have really struggled with because if AI was the word of the year last year, I think the word of the year this year is agentic AI, and like I think it's our initial view that like some of that stuff is just fundamentally insecure, and just the what's the expression I'm looking for? To Erik's point, like there's just there's risks that we can anticipate for. There's risks that we think could be out there. But as those grow, it frankly becomes like an exponentially like large risk surface where there just might be applications of this you don't want to put it in. And we think about this in the context of financial services and financial transactions. I think there's going to be a lot of push to give these agents access to those things, but I don't know how security is not something that you can ever 100% guarantee, full stop. And so if you're deploying technology that has a risk threshold in any capacity, the more access points you give to it, the larger that percentage chance of something going wrong happens. And I don't, I think you can attribute it to a nation state actor as like the ultimate boogeyman, but I just think that there's all sorts of other issues that could just emerge that it's going to be very hard for the average policymaker to anticipate.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming on the first day of exam study week, and it was really a great conversation. Thank you to Erik, to Giacomo, and to Joe.